Thank you so much, Paul, and nice to see everybody again. I hope you had a nice lunch. Okay, there I am. I'm really looking forward to watching this film. I know there was, so I'll give some background context on the movie. Try not to give away too many plot points, which we can discuss after the movie. Liz did share with me one question that I didn't get a chance to respond to from the previous lecture, so I'll just address it briefly, which was there was a question that came in about the roles of women in organizing names list projects, and not just names lists, but reuniting families. And this is a fascinating question, and I think I'll just start by saying much more work needs to be
Really?
I hear somebody. Everybody make sure to mute yourselves. So I'll just say much more work needs to be done on the roles of women in the DP camps. There's a disproportionate overrepresentation of men among the leadership. So that's the first thing. That being said, there are women in prominent roles who work with the JDC in particular. So for example, Abe Klausner talked a lot about he was helped by a JDC activist by the name of Ann Lipa, who helped him in his organizational work, or Miriam Warburg, who worked both with the JDC and the Jewish Agency, who helped people get organized, or working on behalf of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, Greta Fischer, who helped organize the children's home at Kloster Indersdorf. And these children's homes are a really interesting place also to look at attempts to reunite or create new families out of families that are lost during the war. So there's a lot more that can be said about that, but it's an interesting question. And I would just say sort of broadly, one of the bigger themes that we will also see addressed in this film is when a biological family is lost during the war, one of the sort of immediate post-war responses becomes how to create either new biological family, and that means through very quick, in most cases, marriages by two people who meet, find that they are alone in the world and decide to get married, and in many cases quickly start a new family. So that's one way to sort of try to come to terms with the traumatic loss of family by creating a new family in the immediate aftermath of the war. The other way, which I didn't talk about as much, is creating these kinds of surrogate families that we'll see represented in this film. So children's homes, for example, are a way to create sort of a new social network that is a family dynamic, or the kibbutzim that the Zionist youth movements create become sort of surrogate families for people who've lost their families. So, and we could think about sort of the creation of the State of Israel as an attempt to sort of bring back survivors into the larger Jewish family. This is a big sort of symbolic theme, but I think it's something interesting to think about in the context of this program today. All right, so I'll just say a few things by way of introduction to the film, and then we'll have much more to discuss after the film about some of the things that happen in the film. So this film, Lang is der Weg, Long as the Road, is one of the earliest representations of the Holocaust on film. What I mean by that is one of the earliest sort of feature films to recreate or attempt to recreate events that happened during the war in a sort of feature film that's not a documentary. Another example that people may be familiar with is the film Unsere Kinder, Our Children, which was also created in 1948, that was made by the comic duo Jigan and Schumacher in Poland after the war. In this case, the film Lang is der Weg, which is produced and filmed and created in post-war Germany. So you'll see one of the early titles in the film says that it's created with the support of the Office of Military Government of the US Army, basically in Munich, the sort of headquarters in Bavaria in the American zone of occupation. The film both presents sort of the events of the war itself, makes a very strong political post-war argument, which we'll see. It's and it has a message, a very strong message, which we can discuss after you've seen the film. It's written by Yisrael Becker, and as I said, it's basically the first feature film to represent the Holocaust from a Jewish perspective, and I think this is really important. It is an attempt by a Jewish filmmaker, Jewish writers, Jewish producers, Jewish actors to tell the history of the Holocaust from their own perspective. It's shot on location at the Landsberg DP camp, which I mentioned before. At the time, becomes the largest DP camp in US-occupied Germany. It follows a Polish Jew, played by Yisrael Becker, who plays the part of David, and his family from pre-war Warsaw through Auschwitz and then into the DP camps. The young hero, who's played by Yisrael Becker, as we'll see, is deported in the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. He jumps out of a train on an Auschwitz-bound transport to take his chances in the countryside, and he ultimately survives the war with a band of Jewish partisans to search for his family in the ruins of liberated Poland. The film is definitely part of, let's call it a public information campaign. Some might call that propaganda, meant to convince a Jewish audience in post-war Germany and abroad, as well as, and we can discuss this question of who the audience is, a non-Jewish audience in Germany and internationally, of the importance of the Zionist solution for stateless Jewish DPs languishing in Germany. There was a Jewish Cultural Office of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews, which I mentioned before, and they basically take the lead in supporting the production of this film, which is written by Yisrael Becker. It's based to some extent on Becker's life story. He was from Bialystok. He has an experience of jumping off a train. It's not the same as what you're going to see in the movie, and he ends up actually surviving the war, not in the way that we see in the movie. He ends up surviving the war in the Soviet Union, which I know Atina is going to talk about tomorrow. We could talk more about Becker after the film is over. It's fictional, right? So it sort of represents this fictional character, David, and his experiences with his parents. I'm not going to tell you what happens to his parents. You have to watch the movie. As well as encounters that he has in the aftermath of the war. There are major, major themes here that deal with family displacement, creating new families, locating lost family members, and more generally trying to articulate for a broad audience the experiences of Jews both during and after the war. There's a lot of themes which we can talk about. I'm reluctant to give away too many plot points before we watch the movie, but I will look forward to discussing all of these during the film. I just want you to pay attention to a couple of things as you watch the movie. As I've said, it's a feature film, meaning that it's fictionalized, but it uses a lot of documentary film footage. And so you'll be able to tell some of the points where it intersplices actual documentary footage, which I would have to imagine they got with the assistance of the US Army, taking German either war footage or American footage, and intersperses that sort of semi-documentary format with our characters who play sort of these actors who play these fictionalized parts. I want you to pay attention to how it treats the issue of Jewish behavior during the war. So choices that Jewish men, Jewish women took, dilemmas that confronted Jewish families, both in this case, as we'll see in the Warsaw Ghetto, and then the experiences of those who underwent selection at Auschwitz, as well as the experiences of Jews who joined the partisans, the experiences of Jews who may have been turned over by Polish collaborators. All of these things are dealt with in the film. And then a very large part of the film deals with the challenges of trying to find any surviving family in the aftermath of the war, and at the same time creating a new family. I think I've probably said too much already, so I'm going to stop myself now, Paul, so we have enough time to watch the film. So I think I'll see you all in about an hour and 15 minutes after we watch the movie. I'm going to make a few comments about the film now that everybody's seen it, and then I'd really be curious to field any questions. However you want to handle that, Paul. I'll let you sort of handle the way you want to do the Q&A and the discussion, either through the chat or that probably is the best way if people, as they come in and have reactions, comments they want to share. So now that everybody's seen it, I'm curious to hear reactions, and I'm happy to hear from Paul that you found it moving, which I think it is especially poignant on many, many levels. Obviously, especially because it is basically one of the first feature films to tell the story of what happened to Jews during the war from a Jewish perspective. Jewish actors, Jewish writers, shot by Jews in post-war Germany. I mean, there's so many levels, right, in terms of the creation of the film that make it quite fascinating. The one thing that I think is really important in terms of context to that point about telling the Jewish story is that there is this, as you can tell, there is this interweaving between the personal story in the film and then the sort of larger context of what's happening for survivors, for displaced persons after the war, in terms of making sure that their voices are heard, in terms of making sure that the world understands the plight of the Jewish refugees after the war. And I think this is really important. I can't underestimate how important this is, this sense on the part of Jews that even after the war, there was not recognition of what they had just gone through. And I think, you know, we just have to look at, for example, the International Military Tribunal that's taking place in Nuremberg right around the same time to think about the degree to which Jews would have rightfully thought, where are our voices, right? Where are the people who are going to hear what we went through, what we endured? You barely have any Jewish witnesses testify, right? As we've, I think, talked about in other workshops, it takes till the Eichmann trial for the Jews to basically be able to sort of share their stories. And this is on a stage in Israel, not on an international stage. So I think that sort of sense of needing to tell their own story is incredibly important and compelling in this regard. The film itself deals with a certain number of, and I find this fascinating too, we're basically talking about 1947 when the film is being made, 1948 presumably when it comes out, but it's being made, let's say, in the year before that, and already in that period of time, so about 2 years after the war is over, we have these archetypes of how are you going to tell the story of what happened to Jews during the Shoah. Warsaw obviously is a really important sort of central focal point. And there are certain reasons for this, obviously, because it is the largest Jewish city, the largest ghetto, as mentioned in the film, 500,000 Jews, 500,000 Jews crowded into this ghetto. I mean, that makes it the focal point. The uprising is not mentioned, right? So I think that's interesting too. We see the scenes of destroyed Warsaw, we see the rubble after the war, but we don't see the revolt. So that's an interesting, you know, choice on the part of the filmmakers. They would have been deported. So it says in the film it's 1943, and there are deportations taking place from the ghetto. Deportations from Warsaw actually began in the summer of 1942, and 250 to 300,000 Jews at that point in time were deported from Warsaw to Treblinka. So it's interesting to me that, you know, it's sort of, they put Auschwitz in there as a, you could see like Warsaw and Auschwitz being these two sort of identifiable locations. Set aside sort of historical, like would that have happened or not, this becomes like these symbols, which is interesting to me. Of course, and the other thing that in terms of archetypes, so we have the right, left, that very powerful scene where we see David's parents at Auschwitz. It's understood, right? You know, right is a site of life, left is a site of death. And that symbol, it becomes a powerful theme. So again, 2 years after, this is a very powerful theme that he's saying the Shema, and then you cut to the smoke, right? There are these powerful images that we can already see emerging in this film. The train car, right? The scene in the train car is a very powerful scene. Now, again, 2 years after, right? This is a powerful sort of location of memory of Jewish experience during the war. You know, David's father says, and God watches all of this, right? So it becomes sort of this representation of the depth of Jewish suffering that's taking place, and this scene that we see in the film shot in the train car. David, as we know, jumps from the train car, and this is fascinating. I read about this elsewhere. So Yisrael Becker had this experience, not being deported to a camp. He didn't jump from a train car being deported to a camp, but he tells a story later on. He ends up in Israel, and he said that he was on a train, that thought he was traveling to the east, where he was going to be able to sort of get away and move towards the Soviet occupation zone. And he found out that there were Germans doing searches for Jews on the train. And he figured out that he had to jump off the train. And he actually shot that scene there where he's going around a curve and a bend, and he knew that that would be the point where the train car would slow down, and that's when you jump off the train. So he sort of did that from personal experience. So really interesting. Very little else conform his own personal experience. He was the only one who survived from his family. So it's not autobiographical in that sense. He didn't have a mother who survived. It sort of departs there, but there are certain interesting parallels that we see there. The idea of somebody going to join the partisans, the idea of going to fight back, very important theme that emerges in the film as well. As Natalia mentioned, the importance of the central committees in Poland after the war, we see this as well, right? That he goes there, and this is a place where Jews are trying to collect information, and in the midst of doing everything, right? Processing the most recent trauma, processing the loss of their families, everything destroyed, thinking about where am I going to live my future life, you're also looking for family. And that these sort of, the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in Poland plays this, the Central Committee of the Jews in Poland, and then the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in Germany plays this really important role in basically helping Jews find one another. The scene where he goes back to his apartment and Pan Chodecki is there, we hear this a lot in survivor testimonies, this idea of he goes back to reclaim, family property, and the sort of question, you're alive, that question, like not, oh, I'm glad to see that you're alive, but, oh, are you going to come back to reclaim your property? The very loaded question, you're alive. You hear that a lot in survivor testimonies when they try to return, try to find what they've lost, try to find their family, and have this sort of greeting that they experience. The relationship with Dora, which we can talk about, fascinating, sort of very, develops very quickly. The actress who plays Dora is trying to find out more information.
Avi, you might want to shut your video.
Oh, am I breaking up? Can you hear me, Paul? Can you hear me? Paul?
I can hear you. I can hear you, Avi. It's good.
Okay. I hear you.
Good. Okay. I'll stop my video, and that way you can hear my voice. You don't have to see me. So I just was saying about Dora. So the actress who plays Dora, her name is Bettina Moisi, and I looked this up. So she's not Jewish, which is fascinating to me. I couldn't find a lot more information about her, but I did find an article. So it's Wikipedia, but then there's other references to it that say that she was a German actress from before the war who got cast in this role. If anybody knows anything else about her, it's a really interesting question. I'd love to find out more about her biography, but that sort of found quite striking. And the idea of how language is used in the film is really interesting too, right? So you have Yiddish, you have the German voiceover, which does the documentary component of it. You have Dora speaking German. You have the Polish from the peasants and the Polish from Pan Chodecki. So there's sort of this overlapping of languages, which I think is really interesting as well. Two last points about the broader context that I think are interesting to note is it's really, really important to the filmmakers to emphasize the broader context of, here you have a family, a young family coming back, that they've just gotten married. And in that scene where they go back to their, overcrowded apartment or whatever, collective living situation in Landsberg, and they can't even have a moment of privacy, right? And it's sort of the symbolism of we won't have any personal peace. We won't be able to build our own individual futures until the problem of our collective people is solved, right? So there's no sort of like individual experience that can be separated from the collective experience. This is all something that until everyone's needs are addressed, no one will be able to move forward and sort of move on with their lives. You know, it's not coincidental that they have their wedding, and then you have the March, I think it's March of 1947, the Jewish Congress that's taking place with this sort of, you know, open the doors, open the gates to Eretz Yisrael, right? We cannot, you know, enjoy our lives anew as Jews until we solve the problem of the Jewish people more broadly. So the filmmakers want to make this very, very clear. And in that sense, it is a propaganda piece, right? It is this idea of we have to solve the problem of the stateless Jewish people. The world will not know peace again until we solve the problem of the stateless Jewish people. And of course, this is how the film ends, right? They are sitting, he's plowing the land in Germany. He's on a kibbutz in Germany, an agricultural training farm, preparing for what he hopes will be his future life in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. But lang is der Weg, right? Long is the road. It's not enough to find, you know, his new wife to build a new family. It's not enough to find his mother to reunite them, right? This idea that, oh, okay, at least they've finally been reunited. They will not enjoy peace, and the world will not enjoy peace until, you know, the Jewish people are returned to the land of Israel. And that's the sort of final scene on which the film ends. I'm going to try to unpause my video, and we'll see if that works, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Okay, and I'm going to open up the chat. So if anybody has any questions, please send them along.
Chat is open.
So Avi, so while we're waiting for a chat, so you said that there was Unsere Kinder is the other film. That's the Jigan and Schumacher. Were there other films at this time, or not really? That dealt with the DPs and so on.
Yeah, so there's, in terms of feature films, as far as I know, these are basically the first two films. And I have to say, you know, it's the National Center for Jewish Film. It's so important that they, you know, have digitized these films and made them broadly available. There are some other films that you can find archival copies of that are, I guess, more documentary format than feature format. Atina just put in another film, I think, in the chat box of suggestions. Unsere Kinder, I'll just mention. So one of the important issues that's also sort of touched upon in this film, but I would say the political message is more important in this film than it is in Unsere Kinder, is how survivor trauma is addressed in the film, right? There's sort of this question of how does one deal with the traumatic experience, the traumatic natures of one's experiences during the war. And we see this represented through Hannah Yellen in the film, obviously, and she's, you know, the character who is represented and most deeply traumatized and ends up in this sort of sanatorium in Germany. In Unsere Kinder, what's interesting is that in this film, we see again this sort of quasi-documentary format that's filmed with, you know, Shimon Redlich. My colleague Gabi Finder has written about this. You know, Shimon Redlich is one of the child survivors who's featured in the film. So you have like real child survivors acting in this film. There is this idea in Unsere Kinder, in Our Children, that you can process the traumatic nature of the wartime experiences through acting, through drama, through retelling your stories. And there's a much greater sort of focus on, you know, how these children will be able to overcome what they've endured through the war. In this film, I think it's a little bit more in the background, and they're more focused on the sort of political message.
Okay, we have a bunch. I don't know if you can see the questions too, but so.
Yeah, and I have some that came, I think, maybe just to me as well. So.
Oh, okay. Well, let me read. Maybe they're the same or not. Here's a question. Do you know what the immediate response was for the film when it was released?
I don't know. It's a really good question, it's so I don't know, in terms of critical reviews or anything like that. It'll be interesting to find out.
Yeah, no,
Now
that would
now
be
I got to look that up. So
homework.
yeah, is
Homework.
it reviewed in the DP Press? I don't know. It would be worth looking into and finding out. I see I have a question. I'm going to read a question that came to me, if you don't mind, Paul.
Please.
So this comes from Stephen Weitzman, who says, in the same way that until recently victims of sexual abuse were considered somewhat responsible for what happened to them, in 1947 were European Jews also considered responsible for what happened to them by themselves and others? What I would note, yeah, so a couple of points to note on that front. One thing, and Atina mentioned this to me in a chat comment as well, that's important to reference in the film too, is so Dora, apropos sort of sexual violence, there's a couple of instances in the film where it's not overtly addressed, but you do sort of have mention that's made in terms of Dora's wartime experiences that are sort of subtle references, I guess, in the film, or maybe not so subtle references, but it comes across, and that's how it's addressed. This was not Stephen's question, but it is interesting to reflect on sort of how long it takes, especially in the scholarly literature, for these issues to be addressed much more directly in terms of the violence that that's the sexual violence that was endured both by women and by men, really, wasn't talked about in the literature for many, many years, but you could see how it's addressed in the film. But to that other question about sort of the question of, were European Jews considered responsible for what happened to them? So this is a really interesting point. And I think one of the things in the film, and I think specifically about the scene where you could see like David, Hannah, and his father, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the father's name right now. In the film, when they go in the train car, the idea that, don't try to jump from the train, you're going to make it bad for us and everyone else, right? There is this, again, subtle reference and questioning of the degree to which Jewish behavior are they complicit in terms of what happened to them? Should they not have gone, quote unquote, like sheep to the slaughter? And this is something I've written about elsewhere. There was this sense after the war of this stark division between those who, end up fighting back and joining the partisans and joining the ghetto fighters, and those who, allow themselves to be taken. And I think that's an image that we have to think about in the film, the way that's represented in the film. And it has a lot to do also with the elevation of like armed resistance, as opposed to now we talk much more broadly about different types of ways to resist and different types of defiance. But in the film, I think there is kind of a stark divide between those who go passively to their deaths and those who try to evade and escape in this way. This certainly was a problem. This certainly was a problem in Israel, both in the immediate aftermath of the war, and then when survivors first came to Israel, this sort of questioning that took place about what was the nature of Jewish behavior, what did Jews have to do in order to survive, this questioning amongst of the survivors, that diminished their experiences during the war, that looked down upon them. Very, very difficult sort of many, many years of this questioning, I would say, that took place. And this has a lot to do, and I don't have time to get into this, but this has a lot to do in terms of the nature of the Yishuv and the State of Israel's relationship to the Holocaust, and sort of coming to terms with the way that survivors were questioned and treated in the first years after the war, until the point where they begin to tell their stories, and it becomes much more accepted and understood. It took many years for that to happen.
Thank you. I have a bunch of great questions, and I may have to just send many of them to you afterwards, but here's one which I think is pretty interesting. The teacher writes, in the intro to the film, they write about driven from their home for political or ethnic reasons, no mention of anti-Semitism. And she writes, almost sounds like the Soviet view on Nazism. So I was just wondering why the language was like that, if there's any particular reason.
That's a really good question. There's a couple of spots in the film where there are some I think it's interesting you pay attention to the language there. There's another spot in the film where you may have noticed also, you know, he's traveling on a train car and he's juxtaposed with ethnic Germans, you know, presumably Volksdeutsch, who are being returned to Germany after the war. So he's going from Poland, he's juxtaposed. So this is a really interesting sort of question in terms of why they wanted to do this. And I think there are some political issues and political considerations that they want to make. The issue that's at that same sort of early text in the beginning of the film, I think they say, you know, 1 million DPs, right? There are 1 million, you know, displaced persons. Well, Jews were actually a very small percentage of this 1 million, or actually there were probably 10 million at least displaced persons and prisoners of war and refugees and forced laborers who were not Jewish trying to return home. So it's interesting that they make a choice in the making of the film to situate this within a much broader context of displacement after the war. I mean, yes, it's clearly a Jewish story, but I think they're also conscious of a broader audience that they have to engage with in terms of supporting, let's face it, supporting a Zionist conclusion to the problem of Jewish displacement, saying that, you know, we're not going to have peace in Europe until we solve the problem of Jewish displacement. So I think they're trying to, you know, sort of cater to a much broader audience, not just a Jewish audience, but also a German audience, presumably American audience, like a broader audience that they're trying to reach in the film. In that scene where they sort of, I have a quote here. Oh, when he says, so after the war, when he's searching for his mother and he hears the Germans complaining on the train that they're no longer allowed to live in Poland and must return to Germany, David says, so the guy says, you know, let them suffer, right? Let them eat from this bowl or something like that. And David says, we all eat out of the same bowl. So this is a really interesting line considering this context. And there is this sort of placement of Jews and Germans together in terms of the experience of displacement and the idea that, you know, Europe won't have any peace until we solve all the problems of the displaced people more broadly. He said that they waited until the end of the movie. They waited to the end of the filming process to film that scene, and then it felt right to include such a scene, and every member of the crew agreed it was not easy, but it was the right thing to do. And so it's really interesting, like this sort of putting aside the desire for revenge, basically, in terms of in favor of sort of a broader idealistic solution. And this is one of the only references that we see in the movie to this question of revenge, or letting them suffer for what happened during the war. And what I think is interesting about that is that, so I just was reading a relatively new book by Dina Porat about the revenge group after the war of Abba Kovner. And one of the arguments she makes is that the Zionist movement, you know, worked hard to make sure that any desire for revenge or any anger in terms of what happened to the Jewish people during the war would be channeled in what they argued was the most constructive way, which was towards work that would lead to the creation of the state of Israel. So one of the big messages there is, let's take any anger or revenge that we want to have against the German people, and let's not harm what is the ultimate goal, which will solve the problems of the Jewish people right now, which is the creation of the state of Israel. Let's channel, and you can see that in the movie too, let's channel everything in that productive direction. And you could see DPs are represented as people who, you know, have this goal for a peaceful, productive future. This is what they want. They just want to have a place where they could work the land and live quietly in peace.